Welcome back. We're going to take a look at the backstory, the background to a lot of these cults and heresies by looking at the environment of the time, especially on the frontier, and really looking at the nature of revivals, those opportunities, those camp meetings, where often thousands of people gathered together to hear a preacher go through a sermon, and there was typically some kind of call to salvation, or at the very least, a call to holiness itself. And so we have to ask the question, why is it that America, particularly on the frontier, was so concerned with revivals, was so concerned with issues of religion and issues of faith? And there's a couple answers to this. First of all, you have the whole issue of a lack of spiritual discipline. In other words, there was typically a lack of regular prayer. There was a lack of attending, say, a public worship service at church. And there was also a general lack of reading the scriptures or even knowing the basic ideas behind the scriptures. In fact, there are many stories told about the various missionaries or circuit preachers who would go to these frontier villages. And even though churches often did spring up in these villages, it was quite often that they encountered frontiersmen who had very little knowledge of basic theology. I'll give you two examples. The first example was one such missionary came to a town and he asked the person if he could tell him anything about Jesus. So thinking something very basic, something that everyone can say something to. And the man said, Jesus, that name does not ring a bell, but I've only been here for a year, so maybe he's somebody who just moved in and I haven't met yet. In other words, he had no concept that this might be something related to faith, something related to God himself. Another story goes that another missionary came to yet another town, and there he encountered a boy, and wanting to test his biblical knowledge, he said, hey, can you tell me the story of Cain and Abel, specifically how Cain killed Abel? And the boy kind of looked at him with surprise and said, Abel got killed? I didn't know he was killed. He just moved here last week. In other words, they had no concept that the names that they sometimes name their own children might actually be based upon older stories that went back further. Another issue with the frontiersmen and why they typically struggled with religion was they generally had a lack of respect for tradition or a lack of respect for the past. And the reason for that was frontier life was hard. It was incredibly difficult. Most of those men were acquainted with sweat and toil and death. They had seen loved ones die. And so therefore, they were often desperate for good news, but they often had no context to put it in. They often had no background in who God was or how he'd even made his world. And so thus, when preachers did come to town, they found themselves able to have these incredible camp meetings. Meetings, as I mentioned earlier, that had thousands. In fact, the average camp meeting typically had something like 25,000 people and more. The very first one of these that we have on record that really is seen as the beginning of camp meeting revivals occurred at Cane Ridge in Kentucky in the year 1801. It was led by Barton Stone, who himself came from a Presbyterian background, but really saw all the debates over things like doctrine and ideas and how God is sovereign and predestinated people versus how people have a free will. He saw that kind of as a waste of time, a waste of breath and argument. And so he and his followers eventually came up with a couple of slogans. The first was "No creed but Christ." In other words, it was the whole concept that you don't need to write down what you believe, you just need to believe in Christ himself. Now, the sentiment is admirable, the fact that Christ is the final goal. But the problem is, if you don't know who Christ is, you can't explain who he is, nor can you explain what he has done, which is the whole central belief of Christianity. Things like the fact that he is God, but he became man. Things like the fact that he allowed himself to die on the cross to take away the punishment of sins. And then things like the fact that he supernaturally arose from the dead. If you don't actually codify those things as beliefs, it tends to create problems in how you actually live out those beliefs. He also had yet another motto that came out from him and his followers, and that was this: where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the Bible is silent, we are silent. Again, it has a noble sentiment, that essentially the scriptures are authoritative, and the scriptures themselves comment on what needs to be known. But the problem is that since they say that we only speak where the Bible speaks, and since where the Bible is silent, we are silent, that means that if you have a political question or an economics question or how art or literature should be, you tend to kind of retreat from those questions and simply say that the Bible has nothing to say about them, and so therefore Christians have nothing to do with those realms. So this is that era in time where we see Christians begin to retreat from being leaders in the community, whether it be the political community, the business community, the arts community, or the literary community. But all of these revivals still, as I mentioned, because the people were so desperate for good news, these revivals brought thousands together. But they were known for kind of an interesting phenomenon, such as the fact that at these revivals, at which people became so emotionally worked up, there would be these sudden instances of people barking like dogs, or people suddenly going into a dance, which they said was led by the Holy Spirit, or a sudden swooning, where as many as 500 people at once would all fall down, slain by the Spirit. Now, whether or not God chose to work in this way, because he certainly could, it's hard to say. But we really see an interesting kind of distinction at this time. And that is the whole distinction between a revival and revivalism. And I want you to note this distinction. Revivals are where you actually bring the gospel, and it's meant to, of course, call someone to Christ, call someone to faithfulness, but then there's this whole message that they must become a disciple. They must continue the journey. It's not enough to just become saved, so to speak, but they actually have to pursue God and pursue Him in all the things that they do. That means, for example, that if you're a carpenter, then all of the work that you do, because it's a form of worship, it should therefore be excellent work. If you're a husband or a father, if you're a wife or a mother, brother, sister, son, daughter, in any case, the way that you treat your family, those people closest to you, the people who typically annoy you the most because you live with them, all of that matters because it's a form of worship. Whereas something like revivalism is really more temporary. Because in revivalism, you have these incredible moments where you suddenly feel God's presence, so to speak, and you want to give yourself to Him, but then eventually that moment passes and there's no plan for what to do after that. You're always searching for that emotional high. We still struggle with this as a church. We often try to set up these revivals where we'll feel emotionally close to God without considering things like the fact that He calls us to holiness through spiritual disciplines, through how we treat each other, through how we actually work with excellence in our various vocations. Now, there's two men I'm going to give you for this little video on revivals and revivalism. We'll talk about the revivalistic character first, and that was a man by the name of Charles Finney. Now, Finney's dates are 1792 to 1845. And he actually came from Connecticut. He himself was a Presbyterian pastor. And he decided that the Presbyterian Church and really the whole Reformed tradition or the Protestant tradition was somehow misguided. And so he began to leave that because he believed some specific things. First of all, he believed that man could be perfected. He believed that you and I, through actually pursuing God all the way, we could actually live perfect lives in this world, that we could do away with the consequences of sin. He also believed that whenever you did sin, it essentially meant that you were no longer saved unless you repented. And specifically, if you sinned really badly, if you did something that was really bad in terms of what people thought of you, then you had to go and basically be re-saved. You had to essentially go to a service and re-answer the call to salvation and perhaps even be baptized again. So it meant that people lived in a fear that they were always losing their salvation because, as if you're honest with yourself, you'll know that you sin on a regular basis. That's the nature of being a sinner. And that's why we need Christ to actually forgive all sins, past, present, and even future sins that we have yet to commit. But he was known for giving sermons in which he didn't really plan ahead of time what he would say. He would just open his Bible, specifically to passages that he knew very well, and then he would give these mighty calls, these very emotional sermons that were very compelling. He was like George Whitefield in the sense that he was able to get people to listen to him. People admired his ability to speak and wanted to hear what he had to say. But he was someone who wasn't afraid to use drama. So, for example, he had what he called the seat of decision, in which he would have someone who was deciding whether or not to be a Christian sit in the seat, and he would kind of everybody else look at them to make sure that they chose rightly. Or he might even call someone by name who he knew had not given a confession, at least not a confession, at one of his revivals, and he would essentially make that person feel bad until they decided, yes, I'll come up and I'll pledge my life to Jesus. What's curious about Finney is Finney preached to hundreds of thousands of people and probably led most of those folks to some kind of confession of Christ. But because there really wasn't any discipleship, there wasn't really a long-term plan for what those people should do after, many of those people fell away, and perhaps most tragically, Finney's own children walked away from the faith because their father wasn't really concerned with them because they were saved, and he didn't really think that his duties as a father took some kind of prominence or really priority in his life. Now, thankfully, our tale for this video doesn't end with Finney. It actually ends with a man of revival, and that is Asahel Nettleton. Nettleton was also a Presbyterian pastor from Connecticut, and his dates, so you have a reference for when he lived, are 1783 to 1844. And he believed really the opposite of Finney. Nettleton really believed that man is totally depraved, that we are completely fallen. He also believed that grace is freely given by God, that even though we are sinners in this world, and we are of course called to personal holiness, which we must pursue. That's the natural state of the believer. Once he has that incredible change, that regeneration, we delight in the law. But the reality is we are still living in a fallen world with a fallen physique, and we actually pursue sin, sometimes in the deepest reaches of our very soul, it would seem. But Nettleton understood that when you preach to people, it has to be something that they can take from the scriptures directly and actually apply it to their lives. So he had this incredible technique. Instead of just going from place to place and setting up camp to preach to the most number of people available, what he would do is, first of all, he only preached at places he was directly invited to. For another thing, when he was invited, he would go and he would live amongst the people for several weeks, sometimes even a few months. In other words, he took time to live amongst them, to go from house to house or from shop to shop and get to know the people, so that he could see what made them tick. He could see what they loved, and he could actually preach a sermon that was tailored to the condition of that community. It made him an incredibly effective pastor who always preached from the scriptures, who always preached towards a personal holiness. As a result, even though he gave no altar calls, they estimate that some 30,000 people came to faith through Nettleton, and because they came to a faith in such a remarkable way, many of them actually stuck with it, because Nettleton was interested in training long-term disciples who would be faithful in the little things from day to day, because Christ had already taken care of the problem of sin. That was what made Nettleton so effective. We'll talk about some of the wayward ideas tomorrow.